Lingo had this idea, of a football team, and which would be his next sort of big promotional idea. So they're going hunting. They're out in the swamplands there in Marion County in Ohio, and Lingo sort of tells him he wants to start a pro football team, and he wants Jim Thorpe to be the player coach and manager, and he would pay him $500 a week, which was a lot of money at the time, to run the football team, but also work at the dog kennel as a manager. So Thorpe's obviously very interested. That's a lot of money, he gets to play football, but there's two catches. The one catch is the team has to be made up of entirely of Native Americans, and two, that the real main purpose is to advertise his dog kennel and his Airedales.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, gang, how are you? It's Tim Hanlon, as announced, and the little podcast that you've discovered is called Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I can't think of a better way to celebrate the beginning of the current NFL pro football season than by tackling, no pun, or maybe pun, another episode in the realm of pro football. We're going to go back to some of the earlier days of pro football. Our guest this week is a guy by the name of Chris Willis, and he is the resident historian at NFL Film, so an interesting guy from a number of different perspectives. But in particular for this episode, we're going to be talking about a story that is kind of hard to believe if you really think about it. The book is called Walter Lingo, Jim Thorpe, and the Oorang Indians, How a Dog Kennel Owner, yes, a dog kennel owner, created the NFL's most famous traveling team. And the story behind it, we'll get into it in much more depth in a couple of minutes here. Think about it. This is a guy, Walter Lingo, a dog breeder in central Ohio, who frankly couldn't think of a better way to promote his dogs and the breeding of such, Airedales, the breed, which were all the rage in the Roaring Twenties, than by buying an NFL football franchising and using it as a promotional platform for his dogs and his kennel. And in addition to that, part of the promotional specter of the team was hiring Jim Thorpe, one of the original NFL Hall of Famers, and an athlete extraordinaire in both football and in baseball. Oh, and in the Olympics as well. Revered as one of America's greatest athletes, certainly of the first half century, if not longer, to run the team and to be a player and a coach and hire all Native Americans, like Jim Thorpe was, to play on this team. And it's just, it's a mind-boggling story. And any of our friends, and we know we have a few out there who live in the Los Angeles area who fancy themselves as screenwriters and looking for story ideas in the realm of sports. Well, this just may be one of those. And it's the some of the little intricacies of, a traveling team that, did okay on the field, not so great, frankly, but was known for some interesting hijinks at halftime with these Airedale dogs who performed, and again in a ragtag National Football League that was clearly not as defined and robust as it is today. So a fascinating story ahead in the next couple of minutes with our guest Chris Willis from NFL Films about the Oorang Indians of the early 1920s NFL in just a second. We want to remind you, of course, that we are again sponsored by our friends at Audible, the amazing audiobook company that dares you to give a free trial for 30 days and get a free audiobook download for you to try and enjoy the Audible service. And if you indeed want to do that, and I can't encourage you more enough to do that, it's audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free audiobook download and your free 30-day trial of Audible, the amazing audiobook service. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from. They play on just about every device that you've got out there. And I love the audiobooks that Audible has, and it's addictive. And I think you will enjoy giving it a free trial and perhaps even subscribing for a longer period of time. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial of Audible service and your free audiobook download. Give it a try. We appreciate your doing so, and I'm sure the folks at Audible will as well. All right, so let us skate now into our very interesting conversation, rarely or not, with Chris Willis from NFL Films. We're going to talk about Walter Lingo, the owner, Jim Thorpe, the player coach, and the team called the Oorang Indians of the early 1920s here, 1920s NFL, of course, here on the podcast. Maybe for our audience, you can give our listeners a sense of, what you do for a living and maybe perhaps how you came to this story in the first place. I think it's probably directly related, no?
Yeah, a little bit. I've been here at NFL Films since 1996, 21 years now as head of the research library. So my day-to-day job is mainly working with our producers and finding their footage and research material, for all our shows, for our broadcast partners. I had known a little bit about the NFL in the 1920s. That's one of my favorite eras, the 20s and 30s, sort of how the NFL got started. Being from Ohio, a native, I fell in love with football early, so, how the game got started has always intrigued me and sort of, wow, look at, sort of this rags to riches stories. And so through some of that research and some of my writing, over the years, the story of the Oorang Indians always kept popping up. In 2000, I was able to go to Layru, Ohio, where the Oorang Indians were founded, and interviewed a couple of people that were associated with the team, including the son of the owner and a high school player who actually practiced against the Indians. And so they were telling me these stories. So that's sort of my introduction into the Oorang Indian story, back in Ohio. And two of those interviews turned into a chapter in my first book, which was called Old Leather, an oral history of early pro football in Ohio, which came out in 2005. So I had known about the story, and I kept coming back to like, oh, you know what, that would be interesting to sort of jump in more detail than the two short chapters that I originally wrote about. So that's how I sort of got around to tackling the full story of the Oorang Indians.
So before we jump into that part of it, why what is it about the 20s and the early days of the NFL that intrigues you? You're not the only one, and it seems like I don't know, there's almost sort of a legendary quality to it, and maybe some unearthed stories that have really never been told. But I'm just curious as to why that era of the league versus, say, other eras, given your day job.
I think mainly because even working for the league, or even just being a football fan in general, I've always been, interested in how the game sort of got started and why, because it's so popular now. And I think because of NFL Films, even where I work, we're a visual sport. People love to watch it, whether it's the highlights or the games. And, sort of from the 50s, even to the 60s, the Super Bowl era, everybody knows a lot more about those players and how the game, sort of developed and how it became so popular, the number one sport, the number one sporting event with the Super Bowl. But I always go back to those 20s and 30s just thinking, these are the sort of pioneers and the people and the owners and the fans who sort of got it started. If it weren't for them, because the sport was not as popular as Major League Baseball or even horse racing, boxing, and golf, in the 20s and 30s. And obviously college football was even bigger than the NFL and pro football. I just don't think those stories get enough sort of enough attention, or they haven't been written about as much. I mean, if you say Joe Montana or even Jim Brown, Johnny Unitas, Tom Brady right now, everybody knows something about them. But, some of these pioneers and some of these stories like the Oorang Indians, who were only around for 2 years but did help the NFL sort of grow, I think they're important. So that's why I like that era. I like going back to it and just like, as much as I like the game now and I like spending my weekends watching college football and pro football, those sort of pioneers, they do need our attention. And that's why I like sort of jumping into it. I call it the Stone Age, and I go back to the Stone Age a lot.
Yeah. So we've actually had a couple of Stone Age conversations. So, this show is only about 27, 28 episodes old, but, we had a couple of weeks ago a story about the Memphis Tigers, a team which never actually played in the NFL, right, but were part of, maybe one of the first Southern pro teams in the late 20s that had some influence and arguably, still has some influence given the namesake of the Memphis Tigers University athletics program. And, the Cleveland Rams, obviously later we've done a story on, we've done a couple of conversations around, just a whole bunch of other and more to come. But this one, strikes me as being perhaps the most thus far original and frankly kind of hard to believe story, at least the origins of such, when you compare it to what today's modern NFL is of today. Maybe you can give our audience a bit of a background about sort of this guy, Walter Lingo, and maybe the origins of how this story got going.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the original ideas why I wanted to tackle the story. I mean, a few things have been written about it, but not in this sort of detailed form of a full book. I think most people are familiar with Jim Thorpe, who was the star player that he recruited to run the team. But I wanted to, obviously, his story is in there, and we can talk a little bit about him. But I wanted to mainly focus on Walter Lingo because I think he's sort of the unsung hero because it was his idea, and Walter Lingo was the son of a dry goods store owner who in Leroux, if you don't know, is a town of, and it still is, about a town of like 700 to 800 people. It has not grown since the 1920s. It's pretty much a really small town in Marion County, which is about 45, 50 minutes north of Columbus. It's also the home, Marion, Ohio is real close to it, and that's where Warren G. Harding, the president, was at the time in the Roaring Twenties. But Walter Lingo, his dad owned this dry goods store, but he wanted to pursue his passion, and his passion was selling dogs. He wanted to grow the greatest and biggest Airedale dog kennel in the world, or in the country and in the world, and he did. By the Roaring Twenties, he was one of the most successful dog breeders, especially of Airedales in the United States. He was selling up to 10,000 dogs or more a year, spending close to $2,000 in advertising, which I thought was a little too much. But when I did research, he had ads in over a dozen national magazines, including Field & Stream, Forest & Stream, Dogdom, even Vanity Fair, and newspapers. So he had built himself to be this very successful businessman. And so, he sort of recruited Jim Thorpe, for this team. And I always went back to why did he do it? And I'd say that in the introduction, mainly because he was bigger than the NFL. The pro football was nothing at the time. It wasn't pro baseball. It wasn't golf. It wasn't boxing. It wasn't horse racing, college football. All these were bigger sports. He chose a pro football team that was in the NFL, which was just starting its third year in 1922. So Lingo really interests me, and I was able to talk to his son. His son's actually still living there in Ohio, and he sort of was able to tell me these stories about his dad and owning the dog kennel company. But you're right. When you hear the story, it doesn't sound like it's true, but it was in 1922. Was here this dog kennel owner wants to start an NFL team, with Jim Thorpe operating it, and it just makes for such a unique story, especially now that the NFL has become so popular. Like I mentioned about rags to riches, this is really part of that rags to riches.
Well, before we get into the actual team itself, I mean, maybe just a couple of seconds here on this Lingo character, right? Because what is this? What is this magic, I guess, of this Airedale breed dog and the kennel idea behind it? Any insight as to sort of why this was a thing, and frankly, why he was successful at it? I got a sense that this was a popular breed and a significant business for him, both before, during, and after his ownership of this team.
Yeah, well, the Airedale originally came from Great Britain, so it was a dog that was founded and breeded overseas. So it wasn't as popular as the Hound or a few others, sort of in the United States. So he wanted to separate himself. He thought in order to separate himself and become something a little bit more popular or have this greatest kennel, he had to breed a dog that was different. So he chose the Airedale, which wasn't quite as popular at the time. He started his business around 1912, so this is a little bit before he became so popular. So he started breeding an Airedale to sort of be this greatest, sort of hunting dog. He wanted a dog that could sort of separate itself, and that hunters and farmers could use, practically, whether, and eventually he did that with some of his breeds was, he would ship his dogs out to certain farms and he would say, well, this dog is better as a show dog. This dog is better as a hunting dog, or a big game hunting, hunt, deer and, bear or, some of the, sort of high end, hunting animals, or this one can do farm work. Like he became more specific and obviously the Airedale was the one that kind of popped because nobody was, especially in the United States, nobody was really tackling that breed to the extent that he wanted to, where he was trying to, make it as good as he could. So if you wanted to, you could buy the best hunting dog, that you wanted, or, the best, for farm work, or, if you wanted to show a dog, like he became that specific in his breeding and in his training, there in LaRue and around, some of the farms in Ohio. So that's what sort of separated him. The Airedale, like I said, wasn't as popular. He sort of made it popular and that's where the advertising came in. That's what made him very popular around the country was he advertised these Airedales. So if you kind of like were looking for a hunting dog and you're looking in magazines, hunting magazines, dog magazines, you found his ads because they were very popular. They were very, artistic, he put photos and artwork where most people just put a small ad, didn't even have a photo, just didn't have, big font or anything like that, but he did. So that's where he became successful. That's where he made a lot of money, to sort of, establish himself.
Yeah, it seems that, by the, sort of the mid to late 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, right, the Airedale breed, it was almost kind of the rage, I guess, amongst dog owners, including, you mentioned him before, but Warren Harding, who was newly ensconced in the White House, apparently had one as well there. So not a bad platform for promotion, right?
Yeah, no, that helped too. I mean, the myth is people thought it was from his kennel, but which you would think it was, but it was not. It was from a Toledo kennel where the dog was named Laddie Boy, who was in the White House. But you saw all that. That was a big thing in Washington. Like, wow, here's an Airedale in the White House, and that became even more popular, and it helped his sales a lot. Considering that he was from Marion County. Well, it seems
that Walter Lingo was still quite the showman, and obviously somebody who had discovered, with some help, I guess, the power of advertising and direct mail and catalogs and whatnot, and built a significant business. So, given all of that success and given all that sort of, I guess maybe he even named himself the king of dogs. I don't know if it was a name given to him or he self-proclaimed himself as such. So, okay, why then? What upside to a professional football team in a league that you mentioned earlier wasn't even in the top 5, I guess, of sort of national pastimes or sports, in that at that time?
Well, I think for Walter, although dogs were his passion, he was also a outdoorsman and he was a sports fan. He wasn't a huge football fan, per se at the time, but he did like sports. He did like being outdoors. He also liked mingling with sports celebrities. He, especially baseball. He became friends with Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker at the time. Jack Dempsey, a little bit later, and obviously Jim Thorpe too. So he liked sports. It wasn't that he was, against football, So I think what he always thought out of the box a little bit, but he was always looking to promote his business and was also looking to promote the next big idea. Some of them only lasted a year, or like with the football team, it was only 2 years, but I think he always liked the outdoors, sporting, sports activities, anything like that. And he was always looking for that type of avenue, and maybe he thought, hey, you know what, baseball's established, and plus baseball's 6 months of the year. Football's only like 3 months near the end of the year. So maybe he thought just doing a football team, with his good buddy, Jim Thorpe, that might be a little bit better, and stuff. He doesn't have to finance, 6 months of a baseball, or, golf lasts, for multiple months, and boxing is, that type of stuff. So he might have just thought, oh, this is a quick way we can travel the country and, and do this football team to advertise my dog kennel.
So let's talk about then this guy named Jim Thorpe, right? Where I think obviously a well-known and certainly original Hall of Famer in the NFL. Perhaps a little bit of background on Jim Thorpe and perhaps maybe a bit of a hint as to how these two gentlemen actually became friends in the first place.
Well, Jim Thorpe, like you said, especially at the time of when they started the team, was still at the height of his athletic ability, was still probably the most well-known and greatest athlete, in the United States at the time. Had gone to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, became an All-American player, and is probably well known more for winning 2 Olympic golds in the 1912 Olympics in the decathlon and the pentathlon. Sort of proclaimed the greatest athlete in the world. And then sort of had those medals stripped, because he was recognized as playing minor league baseball for money. So that it sort of put a little damp, but then became a professional. That sort of started his professional career. He was playing Major League Baseball at the New York Giants. Then he played pro football at the Canton Bulldogs starting in 1915. So that's where, and that was sort of definitely at his height where he was, probably the best pro football player at the time, was playing Major League Baseball, also, which is kind of like Bo Jackson or Deion Sanders, in modern times, So at the time, and then when the NFL was founded, he was the first president and was still, playing for Canton and played for Cleveland in 1921. So he was definitely on the radar of anybody who wanted to get into sort of, professional sports. And I think the connection mainly is their connection of the outdoors. Jim Thorpe being from Oklahoma, most Native Americans liked to hunt and swim and be outdoors. And like I mentioned before, Lingo liked, being connected to famous athletes and celebrities and those type of name dropping. So, and because he was playing in Canton was only like 90 minutes away from Marion, there in Ohio. So they sort of hung out. Lingo invited him on hunting trips, several times in the late teens and early 20s to sort of hang out there at the dog kennel and go hunting, at night. So that's where the sort of relationship occurred and sort of grew to this sort of, famous idea of the Oorang Indians.
It also seems to me that that Lingo had some appreciation, I guess, for the Indian culture as well, which obviously is a big part of the Thorpe legend, right?
You talking about Native American history?
Yeah, correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, LaRue, Ohio. It was, like I said, it's a small town there, but it also had a lot of Indian history. I believe the Wyandotte Indians sort of had a camp there. So Walter, growing up, heard all these sort of, Native American stories, and he liked reading about sort of, the Indian way of life. So it was something that definitely captured his attention, and sort of just being friends with Jim Thorpe, and Indians always liked to have animals around and to have dogs, and they could connect with animals. They sort of had this little instinct that Walter liked to have around his dogs, that they were really. So I think, all that sort of connected him to sort of starting his team and being a part of that.
Well, all right. So let's talk about. So let's sort of put a date around this, right? So we're talking about circa, I guess, 1921 or so. This guy Walter Lingo and his successful kennel enterprise is chatting it up with a couple of folks, including Jim Thorpe. I guess hunting. I guess for possum, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah, they might have been hunting something. I don't know what, but the story goes, after the 1921 NFL season, Lingo invites Jim Thorpe and one of his teammates, Pete Kalak, on a hunting trip. And now, unbeknownst to Thorpe, he just thinks he's going hunting, but Lingo had this idea, of a football team, and which would be his next sort of big promotional idea. So they're going hunting. They're out in the swamplands there in Marion County in Ohio, and Lingo sort of tells him he wants to start a pro football team, and he wants Jim Thorpe to be the player coach and manager, and he would pay him $500 a week, which was a lot of money at the time, to run the football team, but also work at the dog kennel as a manager. So Thorpe's obviously very interested. That's a lot of money, he gets to play football, but there's two catches. The one catch is the team has to be made up of entirely of Native Americans. And two, that the real main purpose is to advertise his dog kennel and his Airedales. So Thorpe just thinks this is just a crazy idea, but he's on board. And Kalak said, yeah, we'll both do it. Let's do the team. So for 1922, they're going to play pro football in the NFL with this all Native American team and pretty much be a traveling team in the NFL.
All right. So I'm curious as to if you can get into some sense of what Jim Thorpe is thinking of, right? So this is a guy, I mean, for those who, have not gone back and done the research, and I'm sure some of our audience is aware of him, but maybe not necessarily the depth of some of his just, amazing athletic career on a lot of different fronts. But, here's a guy who, for most of the teens, right, was in, Major League Baseball, right? A big Major League Baseball player, and obviously an Olympic athlete as well. And playing a bunch of years in the fledgling and somewhat rough around the edges National Football League. So given all that pedigree, I mean, what do you think's going through Thorpe's head with this somewhat odd idea about, okay, I'll run the kennels during the day and I'll play football, and help this team in this league that isn't even, really tremendously solid at this point?
Well, no, I mean, obviously, I think the money helped. It was a decent amount of money to do the job, but I also think it was probably right up his alley. He's like, oh, wait, I mean, I get to go do stuff outdoors. I can go, hunt, be around dogs, train them, and then also go play football, on the weekends. So I don't think it took much, to twist his arm to do it, and he probably just thought it would be fun to do, and obviously, having a friend like, Walter Lingo, behind him, he'd say, okay, that's fine, so, and you also got to think at this time, like I said, if he has a salary, he's probably going to go where that goes. So, so he knew, hey, you know what? Once I get done baseball, I have a football team to go to, and that's what I want to do. Like I said, I think Thorpe being with a friend like Lingo, being able to be outdoors, being around dogs, and then playing football on the weekend, once he's done with his baseball season, I think that part of it he didn't think was probably crazy or anything about it. Maybe the dogs being part of the football show or the game, that might have been a little, crazy for him. But he was definitely on board to working with his good friend Lingo.
Okay, so let's get a sense then of, so I guess another sort of, red flag, yellow flag, some kind of interesting flag to me is this idea of fielding a team that's comprised of all Native Americans. Was that something that Lingo was kind of doing, bend over backwards to make it irresistible to Thorpe, given his Indian background? Or was this sort of a noble understanding of the Indian culture and a desire to truly see the Native American succeed as a football team? I guess I'm trying to get a sense of what are the motives here for the idea of an all Indian or all Native American team.
Yeah, I think the main thing for Lingo, because Lingo was more of a salesman, he's more of a promoter, so he's thinking more of how do I get fans out to a pro football game to see my team play, but mainly also to see my dogs perform. And one is have a star. So he had Jim Thorpe. He's got the biggest name in sports and the biggest name in football at the time. So what's the other hook is, okay, he's going to be the player coach for a all Native Americans. That's going to get fans out. If it was just Jim Thorpe and a bunch of other guys that nobody knows, then it's okay because you got a star, and you need a star of the show. But so I think Lingo was mainly thinking this is a way of, if we going to be a traveling team, because they weren't going to play home games, they're going to be a traveling team. They need to get fans to the games. So Jim Thorpe and his all Native American football team, that would do it, And over those 2 years, they didn't win a lot of games, but they did get fans to come out and gave the NFL more publicity than the majority of the teams that were in the league at the time.
It almost seems like he's Lingo is borrowing from something that was largely common, especially in things like baseball and Negro League baseball in particular. The idea of barnstorming and the idea of sort of it's a show. It's almost like a circus. It's an event. It comes to your town, and there's a whole bunch of days ahead of time to promote it, and it's not just the game per se. And frankly, the game may even be almost secondary to the idea of the spectacle kind of rolling up into your town.
Well, definitely. Well, that's definitely he thought of that of starting a team. He wanted to advertise his dog. So he wasn't thinking about winning games, building a championship team, or to compete. What he wanted to do was just promote his dogs.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download, but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Okay, so let's talk about how Thorpe puts together a team. For 1922, right, the team gets purchased, and the idea is it's largely going to be a road team. But there are a couple of home games. What is sort of the mechanics of that? Like, are they going to play a couple of home games? They're going to practice in Ohio, I gather. Can you maybe give a little background of that, and maybe how Thorpe went about putting a team together in the first place?
The first summer that they built the team, they were obviously limited because you're only getting Native American football players. So, but because Thorpe went to Carlisle, there was Haskell, there was Sherman out in California. So there were some Indian schools that had played football that he had candidates, and there was a mixture of both of older players that he knew. Obviously Thorpe was in his 30s too, and then there were some younger players that had just finished school that might have been in their 20s. So, but he was limited mainly the talent level. Like, he was able to find, about 15 to 16 players, 17 players the first year, but only a handful of them you would consider NFL players. Obviously Jim Thorpe, Pete Kalak were probably the two of the best, in the NFL or Native American players. And Joe Guyon was sort of the big three. Guyon had played at Carlisle and at Georgia Tech and had been a really good pro player, and obviously went into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1966. Thorpe was the other Hall of Famer. But they were limited talent-wise because some of the players had played a lot, some of the players had not played a lot. So he almost had to recruit guys who were willing to give up like 3 months of time from their families to go play football. So, but they were all Native Americans, and they all sort of gave, their time, like I said, and mainly maybe because to play for Jim Thorpe, but there definitely was a deficiency in the talent level. Like, if this was just a pure NFL team, you could see why they didn't win that many games.
And how about Thorpe as a coach? Wasn't there some speculation, or frankly, some thought that maybe he wasn't necessarily the best potential coach for a team? Obviously, he's a good player, but was he a decent player coach, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time, I think he gets a little bit of a bad rap, because people thought he was just pure talent. He was a little bit lazy. And he didn't coach guys very well, but when he was with Canton, and they won the sort of pro championship in 1916, 17, and 1919, he had a lot of input in the way the team was run. Whether it was offensively, defensively, punting the ball, strategy wise. So when he took over the Oorang Indians, they had daily practice sessions. They were one of the few teams, I think, that practiced for multiple hours. They worked at the Kennel in the morning, from like 8 a.m. to 1 o'clock, had lunch. Then they would practice, from like 1 to 5. It was like a 4-hour session in the small field there. And then they would have dinner, rub downs, and then they would actually run the dogs at night. But they had daily practices, where they trained and sort of went over their skills and that type of stuff. It was just maybe hard for him. Now, sometimes he might have lost interest. I think that was obvious in some of the games that the Oorang Indians played, but he had limited talent, but also the main idea of the team was to sell dogs. It was to perform, with the dogs at halftime. And so if you got behind, early in the game, you might have lost interest. You're like, oh, we're just here to sell dogs, and you might not have competed. But if you were in the game, maybe he coaches it up. So, he wasn't the greatest coach, and there were times that he might have allowed, the players to do certain things, or allowed them to relax or whatever. But I think at times he coached them up. There was one story in the book that I wanted to tell that I thought was very interesting. Is in the first season, they played the Dayton Triangles in the first game, and they got crushed 36-0. So you might think, oh, yeah, they don't care. He's a bad coach. But that following week, he went to Lingo and said, we need to get better at fundamentals. We need to get better at tackling. And they bought one of the first bucking machines, which was kind of like a blocking sled, and they bought tackling dummies. And there's articles in newspapers, in the Marion newspapers, that say that, at the practice field, the Indians are sort of learning better how to do, the techniques with the dummies and the 3,000-pound blocking machine. So if he didn't care, he wouldn't have gone to Lingo and sort of purchased these type of things or spent the extra money, And they also played a non-conference game a little bit later against Bucyrus on like a Wednesday in front of 100 fans, because it was sort of arranged kind of late. So, but it was more of a practice game because he wanted the guys to get more practice, So I think, like I said, there are times where he didn't coach as well, but there are also times where I think he sort of went out of his way to try to make the team better.
I think it's also important to recognize that, circa 1922 and the years around that time, right, there was the NFL with actual teams in the league and a circuit. But there was also a hefty dollop of independent football teams out there, right? And that seemed to be the combination of the schedule that the Oorang Indians were playing in 22. It was a little bit of NFL teams, but also independent teams too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. All the NFL teams played non-league teams, especially through the 20s, 30s, even into the 40s, and it was just a way to make extra money. Also, they were kind of practice games to get guys in shape. They didn't have they didn't have any off seasons, or, training camp was really only a couple weeks too. So it wasn't like they were nowadays where you prepare all year and you're kind of in really good shape. And, but no, they would play these non-league teams. Some of them were really good. Like you mentioned, Memphis Tigers were really competitive. Probably could have been an okay NFL team, if they were in the league. But yeah, the Oorang Indians, if you want to, I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but they only played 20 NFL games, and they went 4-16. So they were 3-6 in 1922 in the NFL, and they were 1-10 the second year. They kind of lost interest the second year, but they also, won some of those non-league games, so which were against teams that were okay, but that was very popular back then to subsidize the sort of league games with some of these sort of league teams, to help you get better, and also to make a few extra bucks.
Well, still pretty respectable, right? I mean, given a team that didn't exist the year before, going 3-6 in the league, 5-8 overall, it's not too bad as a start. But regardless of that on-field performance, right, there was always these halftime shows. Do you want to maybe speak a bit about what that was all about, and obviously a big part of why the team existed in the first place, to promote the dogs, but maybe a little bit of a hint about what a halftime show was like.
Yeah, Walter Lingo, I mean, obviously that was his main reason to start the team, was to promote his dog kennel and his Airedales. So most of the games when they traveled, they did travel with the dogs. There was one article that said they took a pet coyote to one game. But what they would do is, during halftime, which wasn't very long, it was a shorter halftime, but they would bring out the dogs and they would sort of put on this little Wild West show. So the dogs would do tricks. I think one of the big climax they would be a rescue dog, and it would kind of save this person, because you got to think this is coming off World War I too. So some of these Airedales had been in the war. They had performed these rescue missions, of saving a soldier. So they would sort of do these little Wild West with the Indians, to sort of promote the dogs and what they could do. And then the climax would be maybe the dog saves this soldier, and you can, oh, wow, these dogs are very special. They can do all these things. They can hunt, they can save lives. And so all this big sort of entertainment, which we take for granted now, Lingo thought of in 1922, 90 plus years ago. So, but that was a huge part of Lingo sort of wanting to do the team and to do these sort of halftime shows.
Was it, based on your research, was this kind of the first concept around a halftime entertainment? Or it seems like, based on some of the things that I've read and some of your writings in this book, that maybe this was almost sort of the beginnings of the modern day halftime show in professional football. I
wouldn't say it's the first, but it was definitely one of the earliest, especially in the NFL, to have a sort of halftime or any type of entertainment. And usually probably just went to the sidelines for a couple and then came back out, But it was still, even a decade or two before even some type of entertainment besides maybe a band for halftime. So definitely this is one of the earliest, if not the first, sort of maybe planned entertainment type of thing for, fans, to experience while at an NFL game.
Do you think it played some effect on how they performed in the field, especially in the second halves of these games, because of their inability to take some rest during halftime and have to put on a show in between the two halves?
Yeah, I think some of the players, some games you could see maybe they got a little worn out, or like, oh wow, it's only 7-0 at the half during the game, and then all of a sudden, they lose 30-0 because they were a little bit tired. There were some games where they competed for 4 quarters, especially the first year. The first year they were much better at trying to make the effort, trying to play hard, do the show. And I think Lingo knew that, maybe they scaled down at certain times for the show, because especially, like I said, that first game they lose 36-0. You didn't want them to have those scores every week. You wanted fans to be somewhat interested that they might play a good game, because if the scores are 50-0, 30, then fans would probably not even bother coming. So they knew that's why I mentioned the Thorpe getting the tackling dummies, the bucking machines, and having the extra games, because they knew that they at least had to be somewhat, competitive on the field if they wanted people to at least show up, and they did. The attendance figures were really good, for both seasons, and definitely especially in 1922.
When do you think the players kind of, either lost interest or kind of, resigned themselves to the fact that they were more of a show than they were a team, or did that not even creep in? I mean, I get the sense that not all of them were fully on board, so to speak, when the show came around at halftime and the real, deal behind why the team was there in the first place.
I think the players, for the most part, the first year they were into it. They bought into it. They played hard for Thorpe. There were only, I think, 3 games the first year that they sort of got out of hand. The second year, sort of in the middle of the year, there was some interest. They had like 3 or 4 games where they didn't score a single point, and got beat like 57-0, 26-0, 28-0. So I think the middle of the second year, maybe competitively, and then at the end of the year, they actually turned it on, which I think they knew that this was only going to probably last 2 years, because the last couple of games in 1923, they played some of their better football. They almost beat the Cardinals in Chicago, lost by 3, and then they actually won their last game that they ever played in Louisville, who wasn't a good team per se, but they went out and won that game, which was their only win in the NFL in 23. But I think for the most part, I think they understood why they were playing, mainly for the advertisement. But especially a lot of these players, this was their only time they played in the NFL. Thorpe and Guyon and Kalak, they played for other teams. And I think I mentioned this in the book. I think there was only 4 other players who went on to play any NFL games, which wasn't much, after 1923. So most of them just went back to their reservations, went back to their families, and never played a down of football again. So they, I think, appreciated, just this time playing for Jim Thorpe, who was somewhat of an idol to some of these players, especially the younger ones. So I think for the most part, they kind of knew what they were getting into, and they just allowed it to play out, to the extent that it did.
So what do you think was the straw that broke the camel's back for Lingo and his ownership of the team? Because obviously, 1923, I guess they had a 1-10 record overall, I think it was. And, obviously, was it losing even promotional power? I mean, why did he kind of end it all after the 23 season, do you think?
I think it just ran its course. He was in the dog business. He wasn't in the pro football business, the NFL business. I think he liked being around the Indians. I think he liked being at the games a little bit, traveling. But I think after the second year, he's like, I'm done with what am I going to next? And that's what he did for the next. He would go on to the next promotional item, and he went and did a sporting magazine, which Thorpe actually helped do a little bit, probably mainly for his name. He didn't do a lot of the writing, but he did a sporting magazine. He developed more, sold more dogs and things like that, before he had the Depression and the bankruptcy, and things like that. But no, he just went on to his next promotional item, mainly was the sporting magazine, that he did next. So it wasn't anything that sort of, oh, wow, we're not winning, or, because the attendance figures in 23 were still pretty strong. They were getting 4, even 5,000, which at the time was very good for an NFL game. But he just said, 2 years, let's go on. What's my next thing? What's my next promotional thing? I want to do the sporting magazine.
Do I have this right? That Lingo attempted to do something similar using basketball and even Jim Thorpe later in the decade?
Well, I think there was I think it was more in baseball. They did a little bit of the other sports, but wasn't as big as joining a pro league. It was more mainly they just played a few exhibition games, the Oorang name or whatever, but was not in a league. They didn't play Major League Baseball. They didn't play in a league in basketball. It was just a Native American team traveling. Okay, so what do you think then what legacies, if any, come from this? Obviously, it's a curious little footnote in pro football history, right? It speaks obviously to the relatively scruffy nature of the NFL at that time. It's clearly an amazing promotional platform and opportunity. Are there any other sort of things that sort of come out from this, and perhaps maybe why the story was kind of buried for such a long period of time? Well, I think it definitely is one of the more unique stories to the NFL's rags to riches, overall sort of historical tale. There's a few things that you can point to, and the Oorang Indians is one of them. They were, like I said, even though they only played 20 games, which doesn't sound like a lot, they were one of the biggest draws of those couple years. The league needed publicity. They needed stars like Jim Thorpe to play. Their average, I think the average NFL crowd was like 2,500 or 2,600 in 22 and 23. Well, they averaged almost over 3,000 to 4,000 fans. And I think 8 of their 9 games in the first year, they were over 4,000, 3 to 4,000 every game, so including a couple of them that were double the average of regular NFL games. So, and also the one thing Lingo did was he had photos taken of the team, of individual players and the team, and they were in newspapers all across the country and in the cities that they played in, which every NFL team wasn't doing at the time. So I think the legacy is helping, even if it was just for the 2 years, helping, sort of the publicity and promotion of the NFL on a positive level. Like, fans were going, even if they just went for Jim Thorpe or even for the Dogs, they still were going out to games, and it sort of helped the sort of NFL. And I think overall, when you see how the NFL is now, this is part of its legacy. Like, hey, this is how it got started. These are some of the stories that are important to why the NFL is as big as it is today.
Has the NFL ever formally either recognized or celebrated this team, the story behind it? I mean, look, you had, on one level, right, you had, by my estimation, I think it was like 10 Indian tribes that were represented by players on the 2 seasons of this team. I mean, it seems to me like this is a very worthwhile and frankly, important opportunity to go back into history and to remember this in some way, shape, or form. Clearly, the Indians did not sort of absorb themselves or get absorbed into a current franchise lineage. But I'm just wondering if the league either has or maybe has plans someday to somehow either formally recognize or throw back or something for this story and team.
No, I don't. I don't think it's done a sort of major thing, so to speak. I know in 1997, the Ohio Historical Society put a historical marker up at the old practice site where they played. So, and it has a picture of the team on it. And during that celebration and the unveiling of that historical marker, I know the former commissioner of the NFL, Paul Tagliabue, wrote a letter to the town, sort of, acknowledging, this sort of big event that they were getting this historical marker, and also that they are the smallest town to ever have an NFL franchise. And it's going to be a record that's never going to be broken. It had 800 citizens. So I'm pretty safe to say that that's a record that's never going to be broken. But so they've helped a little bit along the way. They haven't acknowledged, maybe a big thing, for, Leroux or the Oorang Indians. But the town does still, appreciate that they had this little moment, for 2 years. And like I said, that historical marker is pretty nice to have there. As you drive into the town, you can see it, where the old practice site was. So it's definitely, that's something that they can hold their hat on.
I would think it could be fodder for somebody in Hollywood, right? It's interesting based on my research. I mean, you had some really just some great names that you could create a story, semi accurate if you wanted to, right? I mean, Stillwell Sanook and Joe Littletwig, and of course Eagle Feather and Baptiste Thunder. I mean, these are real names of real players who donned the uniforms of the Oorang Indians in the early 20s in the NFL. And just saying those names alone to a creative type is probably a fodder right there for a story that could be set during those times. And clearly some of the things that you've unearthed in your exhaustive research of this team could be brought to bear perhaps on a more public platform like a movie or something like that. I just wonder if anybody's even circled around this idea as possibly a story for a movie.
I have not heard, like I said, it does have some, sort of Hollywood tales that you can bring out, an all Native American team being run by a dog kennel owner in this small Ohio town where they're traveling to, big cities like Chicago, they go to Canton, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cleveland. Like they're traveling to these cities to play football games, but also to advertise. So it does have a little bit of, you can write a Hollywood script to it, and you're right, and that's one thing Lingo also did. Some of those, you could use their Indian names, but he would give Indian names also just to make it a little bit, I think some of the players were, Leon Boutwell was named Little Cyclone, like you mentioned Eagle Feather, that was Sherman Pierce, but, Red Fang, he gave one player, Bob Hill, War Horse, so, War Eagle, Woodchuck, like all these sort of, names that you think, hey, but this actually happened. It wasn't made up. These were either their Indian names or, given the nickname or whatever. So it definitely has a little Hollywood feel to it.
Well, we put this out to our listeners, right? So anybody in the LA area, and we do have a few Hollywood types that somehow have discovered this show and have found some fodder for for things to explore further. The book is called Walter Lingo, Jim Thorpe, and the Oorang Indians, How a Dog Kennel Owner Created the NFL's Most Famous Traveling Team. The author is Chris Willis, who has been our guest. The book is published by Rowman and Littlefield, and as they say, you can find it wherever good books are found. We'll have a link to it on our website and all that. Chris, this is really interesting stuff. And by the way, I highly encourage folks to seek out this book. There's some really great pictures in here, as well as some very detailed information about sort of the whole sort of legacy story behind all of this. And, it's kind of, this is truly, in my mind, of the stories that we've explored so far. This kind of the truth is stranger than fiction. I mean, I don't know if you could script this idea, right, and have it believed by most people that a dog owner wants to promote kennels and do halftime shows, and, oh, by the way, is going to leverage a fledgling franchise in a still embryonic National Football League as the mechanism to do it. Hard to believe, but it's true, and I think it's an amazing story that you were smart enough and creative enough to delve into and bring to life. So I thank you so much for letting us hear more about this story. Maybe you want to give us a sense of what else you're doing now, what other topics that you might be focused on. And obviously you've got a day job at the NFL, but I got to think it's a treasure trove of other potential ideas for you.
Yeah, I moved on to my next book idea. If you don't know, in 2019, the NFL will be celebrating its 100th season. So it's going to be a big fall and year for NFL history. So I'm going to tackle a biography on sort of the NFL's first superstar, and that's Red Grange. So it's going to be a full-scale biography on the Galloping Ghost, and it'll come out the fall of 2019. Rowan and Littlefield will publish it too. But I'm knee-deep in the Galloping Ghost right now.
That's great, Chris. Well, good luck with the upcoming NFL season. Good luck with that book, too, and hopefully we'll stay in touch, and maybe we may actually ping you for some potential imponderables as we delve deeper into various nooks and crannies of the old NFL and the current NFL and the lineages that we discover. So I look forward to staying in touch, and thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Tim. I appreciate it. Had a good time.
All right, thank you to our guest, Chris Willis from NFL Films. Probably has the coolest job out there as the resident historian for the treasure trove that is the NFL Films organization. We thank him for regaling us in this interesting story, if you're listening out there in Hollywood, about this interesting team from the early 20s NFL called the Oorang Indians. The book is, again, titled Walter Lingo, Jim Thorpe, and the Oorang Indians, How a Dog Kennel Owner Created the NFL's Most Famous Traveling Team. It is published by Rowman and Littlefield, and it is available wherever fine books are found, including a link off of our episode description on goodseatsstillavailable.com, our website, where you can get a copy with one click of this book, as well as a bunch of other books that Chris has written, including The Columbus Panhandles, A Complete History of Pro Football's Toughest Team, 1900 to 1922, published in 2007 by Scarecrow Press. The Man Who Built the National Football League, Joe F. Carr, which came out by Scarecrow in 2010. I also want to mention, too, that Chris is an Emmy Award winner last year for his contributions to HBO's hit series Hard Knocks, which was that year was the story behind the lead up and the current and the season of the Houston Texans. So interesting background and stories told by Chris Willis, and we thank him again for being part of our show for this week. We want to thank you, of course, for listening, as always, and we also like to thank you for giving us a shout out or a follow on our various social media platforms. If you're on Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. If you are on Facebook, you can like us there. If you're on Instagram, you can find us at Good Seats Still Available. And let us know what your thoughts are. If you go to the website, goodseatsstillavailable.com, you can send us email and all that kind of stuff too. We'd love to hear from you, and please keep your cards and letters coming, as they say. And once again, we thank our production friends at Podfly, Eric Begay, Jerry Payne, Corey Coates, David Gregerson. Thank you to Podfly for all your podcast producing needs. Feel free to visit them at podfly.net and tell them that Tim Hanlon and the Good Seats podcast sent you. We will see you next week with another fun-filled episode. Who knows what we'll be talking about next, but I assure you it will be interesting and curious, and we look forward to speaking to you then. Take care. Until next week, take care, everybody.